just as soon as the people require it, close quote. Now, what does Douglas mean by as soon as the people require it? The voice of the people in our federal government is Congress. As soon as Congress requires it, as soon as Congress changes the laws. Douglas would go on in his article to encourage his readers to lobby Congress. Send petitions to your congressman. Go to Washington if you can. Meet with your congressman to get the laws changed. But Douglas and Lincoln do not believe that Congress will change these laws until it becomes an indispensable military necessity. In other words, when Congress understands that it's absolutely necessary to change these laws in order to preserve the Union, in order to accomplish the paramount objective of the war, which is to preserve the Union. So the question is, when did the majority in Congress understand that it was absolutely necessary to change these laws in order to preserve the Union? Well, in the spring of 1862, the war had been going on for about 1 year. Union General George McClellan would assemble arguably the best trained and best equipped army in the world. McClellan would train his army here in the Washington area. He would take his army down the Virginia Peninsula, marching up the Virginia Peninsula, and by the 1st of June, 1862, McClellan's army, the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, was within 10 miles of the rebel capital, Richmond, Virginia. On that same day, June 1st, 1862, General Robert E. Lee took command of the rebel forces in defense of Richmond. General Lee's army was less than half the size of McClellan's army. But Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing that his army was 4 times its actual size. Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing that wooden cannons, often referred to as Quaker guns, were indeed real cannons. Now, they were called Quaker guns because they were ultimately peaceful or friendly guns. They were simply logs and could not fire anything. But Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing they were real cannons. Lee deceived and outmaneuvered McClellan. And in the first week of July 1862, word gets to Washington that McClellan's army, the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, is in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat. And later that July, Congress would pass the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to employ persons of African descent in any military capacity in which he saw fit. Now, this legislation, born of military necessity, was on President Lincoln's desk for signature on July 17, 1862. Another important piece of legislation was on President Lincoln's desk that day. It is referred to as the Second Confiscation Act. In Section 6 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress gave the President the authority to seize, to confiscate, to take all property of persons in states in rebellion. Now, those held as slaves were claimed as property. President Lincoln is being given the authority by Congress to take, to confiscate all slaves in states in rebellion. In Section 9 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress declared forever free all persons held as slaves by supporters of the rebellion. President Lincoln signed both these pieces of legislation into law on the 17th of July, 1862. He then had the legal authority as President of the United States to bring men of African descent into the federal army and to declare free slaves in states in rebellion. 5 days later, July 22nd, 1862, he met with his cabinet. He informed his cabinet members that he was ready to issue the Emancipation Proclamation immediately, acting on the authority that Congress had given him. He gave a draft of his proclamation to his cabinet members and asked for their advice. One of his cabinet members, Secretary of State William Seward, advised President Lincoln not to issue the Emancipation Proclamation at that time, in July of 1862. Now, Secretary Seward was an abolitionist out of New York. He wanted to see slavery abolished throughout the United States. He supported emancipation. He was Harriet Tubman's benefactor. He had financed the Underground Railroad. Indeed, he himself had assisted some on escaping along the Underground Railroad. Yet in July of 1862, he is advising President Lincoln not to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Why? Congressional elections were coming up. And Secretary Seward tells the president, we've just suffered the greatest disasters of the war. And if you issue this proclamation now, after those humiliating defeats, quote, it will be viewed in the mind of the people as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching out its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching out her hands unto the government, close quote. Ethiopia was commonly used to refer to African Americans in the 1800s. Secretary Seward is telling President Lincoln that the voters are going to view this as a cry for help to the Negroes. So he advises President Lincoln to wait for a military success, a victory on the battlefield. that would mask, that would hide this cry for help. President Lincoln calling the Emancipation Proclamation a practical war measure considered Secretary Seward's advice wise advice. Now, a prudent president, a wise president, takes wise advice. Lincoln waited to claim his victory. He would claim his victory on the bloodiest day in American history. Not the bloodiest battle in American history, but the bloodiest day in American history. September 17, 1862. A battle about 85 miles northwest of Washington near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Officially it is called the Battle of Antietam. In 12 hours, 22,000 casualties. Well over half of these 22,000 casualties were Union soldiers, Lincoln soldiers, but the rebels under Robert E. Lee withdrew from the battlefield, so the Union Army under George McClellan claimed victory. And 5 days later, September 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, in which he warned the states in rebellion that if they did not lay down their guns and return to the Union in the next 100 days, he was going to declare free their slaves on January 1, 1863. Well, the rebels did not believe that Lincoln and the Union Army could make good that threat because they believed they were winning the war. They called the Battle of Antietam the Battle of Sharpsburg, and a draw, a tie, not a defeat. Viewed as a part of a larger military campaign where General Lee's army under Stonewall Jackson, General Thomas J. Jackson, had captured Harper's Ferry. If you have a victory and a tie, you call it a victory. And that's exactly what the Confederacy did. But the Northern press focused exclusively on that battle near Sharpsburg, calling it the Battle of Antietam and a Union victory, giving President Lincoln, more specifically, the Republican candidates in the 1862 congressional elections, some political cover. And I do want to point out that President Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, even though it lost 21 seats in the House of Representatives, it retained the majority in the House and in the Senate in the 1862 congressional elections. So the decision by President Lincoln to wait for a military success before issuing his Emancipation Proclamation was indeed a prudent military decision, or let us say political decision. Frederick Douglass would write in his monthly in October 1862 that in order for the Emancipation Proclamation to be meaningful, in order for it to free any slaves, two conditions had to be met. One is that the states in rebellion still had to be in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. And the second condition is that the rebellion had to be suppressed. I want you to appreciate this. African Americans in 1862 understood that the Emancipation Proclamation was not going to free them on January 1, 1863. So what they're watching for on Watch Night, which is on December 31st, 1862, they're not watching for everyone to be freed on January 1. They're watching for that moment in history where it becomes legal for them to free themselves by saving the Union. By enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, by saving the Union, they get to free themselves. That's what they're celebrating. They're not celebrating when liberty came. They're celebrating when the opportunity to secure their liberty came. But with the Constitution of the United States. In league with the Constitution of the United States, it would now be legal for them to pursue and secure their liberty. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation as, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, close quote. Scholars, I want you to pay close attention to the President's language within the proclamation. He did not pretend that this was a moral humanitarian document. Within the proclamation, he is explicit. He's clear. He calls it a fit and necessary war measure for what? For preserving the Union. For accomplishing the paramount objective of the war, which is to preserve the Union. And in this fit and necessary war measure for preserving the Union, President Lincoln declared forever free all persons held as slaves in the 10 slaveholding states that were in rebellion. Not in the 15 states, but in the 10 states that were at war with the United States for their independence on January 1, 1863. In the 5 slaveholding states that accepted Abraham Lincoln as president and federal authority, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. Why? It's because Congress did not give President Lincoln the authority to seize property and declare free slaves in states that were loyal to the Union. Only in states in rebellion. Only in states that had to be brought back to the Union by military conquest. But remember, the Army needs help. In the Emancipation Proclamation is where President Lincoln issues his public order to his field commanders to receive men of African descent into all armed services of the United States. This cry for help is so well masked, so well hidden, that in the 21st century, we still have many teachers simply teaching. President Lincoln freed the slaves on January 1, 1863. No, he did not. He declared free slaves in states that were in a bloody war against the United States for their independence. The only way the enslaved would be set free is that the Union had to be preserved. The paramount objective of the war had to be accomplished. If we want to appreciate just how important these soldiers were and the Emancipation Proclamation was in winning the war, we need only follow the general who wins the war. General Ulysses S. Grant. General Grant wrote a letter to President Lincoln in August 1863, 1 month after Grant had captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, which Lincoln called the key to victory. Grant had secured the key to victory on July 4th, 1863, with the help of African-American soldiers, sailors, guides, scouts, and spies. And Grant would write to President Lincoln, August 1863, quote, "By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally," close quote. I want you to pay close attention to the general's language. He does not say by freeing the Negro, does he? He says by arming. And he does not say we've simply added more bodies to our army. That's not what the general said. The general said we've added what? A powerful ally. LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Kobe Bryant. You got my point. Difference makers on the battlefield. That's what the general is saying. And in 1863, whether we're talking about battlefields in what was known as the Western Theater along the Mississippi River Valley, or on battlefields in what was known as the Eastern Theater along the Atlantic coast, African-American soldiers not only demonstrated that they could and would fight, they demonstrated that they could and would fight well. In March of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant became the top general in the Army. General-in-Chief of the Army. He arrived here in Washington, spring 1864, and there were 0. So March 1864, he becomes General-in-Chief. He arrives here in Washington, March 1864, and there are 0. No United States colored troop regiments in the Army of the Potomac. The jewel of the Union Army, that army responsible for the defense of Washington, the principal army that attempts to capture Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. General Grant would immediately begin transferring African-American regiments from other regions of the country in the Virginia theater. Grant wants his powerful ally on the battlefield in the most important campaign of the war, the campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. By the middle of 1864, African-American soldiers in Union uniform had captured and occupied a portion of every state in rebellion, to include the state of Texas. So, every state in rebellion. So the word of the Emancipation Proclamation is in every state in rebellion in 1863, in the presence, 1864, in the presence of African-American soldiers. So if you ever hear that the word of the proclamation didn't get to Texas until June 19, 1865, you can appreciate whoever is telling you that does not know the truth. African-American soldiers served in every branch of the Army. They were in the infantry, foot soldiers, cavalry, horse soldiers, artillery, firing cannons, musicians. In today's military, the soldier that does the job of the field musician or drummer boy, we call him a field or radio operator or communicator. The field musician or drummer boy, he did not have to know how to play music. He had to know what the series of beats meant for each command so that he could relay the command to the commander. He was a signalman. Very important job for our young drummer boys. Average age of a drummer boy during the Civil War was 15 years old. The youngest drummer boy to serve was a young African-American boy who enlisted in Camp Nelson, Kentucky in 1864 at the age of 8 years old. His name was Elijah Mason. Elijah Mason, at 8 years old, was the youngest soldier to serve in the Civil War. Elijah Mason, his name is on our Wall of Honor under the 114th United States Colored Troops. African-Americans served as pioneers. In today's military, Army and Marine Corps, we call them combat engineers. In the Navy, we call them Seabees. These are combat construction workers, often required to go out in front of the Army, build bridges, lay railroad tracks. Very important to a fighting army are its combat construction workers, or pioneers, as they were called during the Civil War. And African Americans served in an integrated Navy. 25% of the U.S. Navy was comprised of African American sailors. That's 25%. Now, during World War II, the 1940s, African American sailors were only stewards and cooks. During the Civil War, there are 25% of the Navy. And if they were only stewards and cooks, you would not have had a fighting Navy. You'd have a Carnival Cruise Line. They served in a myriad of duties. Navigators, pilots, engineer officers, firemen, gunners, gunners' mates, boatswain's mates, landsmen, seamen, stewards, cooks, a whole myriad of duties. The first African American to receive our nation's highest military honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor was a sailor. His name was Robert Blake. He received his medal on April 16, 1864, becoming the first African American to receive the Medal of Honor. Robert Blake was one of 7 African American sailors who received the Medal of Honor for acts of courage in combat. There were 18 African American soldiers who received the Medal of Honor for acts of courage in combat, bringing our total to 25. African American women, like European American women, could not enlist in the Army. It was illegal. Those who do serve in the Army, they disguise themselves as men and fought. If they did not get caught, we tend not to know anything about them. One African American woman, Lucy Carter, she got caught, so we know something about her. When they caught Lucy Carter serving with the 10th United States Colored Troops, they kicked her out of the Army immediately. But instead of just sending her away, they recognized her commitment to fight for freedom, and they employed her, the Army employed her as a guide scout spy. In the Virginia Theater, Lucy Carter was a guide scout and spy. The most famous guide scout and spy during the Civil War was another African American woman. Her name, Harriet Tubman. In June of 1863, Harriet Tubman, working in the Department of the South, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, she would become, and still is, the only American woman ever to lead U.S. soldiers on a raid. She led 300 men down the Combine River in South Carolina in June of 1863. 300 men from the 2nd South Carolina Infantry of African Descent. Later, the 34th United States Colored Troops. Highly successful raid. Destroyed the rice plantation infrastructure of that region of South Carolina. Liberated over 800 people. After the raid, General Quincy Gilmore would have Harriet Tubman paid as, quote, a special agent, close quote. So I like to call her Special Agent Harriet Tubman. One other woman who would move here to Washington, D.C. late in the war, and at the end of the war, after the war, would attend Howard Law School and graduate from Howard Law School. Her name, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She wasn't a soldier, however. She was the only woman in the Civil War to be commissioned a recruiting officer by the governor of the state. Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana commissioned Mary Ann Shadd Cary in March of 1864 as a recruiting officer. What does that mean? That means that men, recruiting agents, worked for her in the recruiting of men for the Army. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary in 1864 was a leader of men. I want you to appreciate that. Like Harriet Tubman, who is a leader of men. These are leaders in the African American community. Mary Ann Shadd Cary and Harriet Tubman, if we were to give them military ranks, we call her Captain Harriet Tubman, and we call Mary Ann Shadd Cary Major Mary Ann Shadd Cary. On February 18, 1865, the cradle of secession was captured by African American soldiers. Now, Charleston, South Carolina is called the cradle of secession because the first state to secede from the Union, to declare their independence from the United States, was South Carolina. December 20th, 1860, and their secessionist convention met in Charleston. When the Civil War began, the rebel headquarters was in Charleston. So Charleston is considered the cradle of secession. And on February 18, 1865, African American soldiers captured Charleston, the cradle of secession. Now that's headline news, wouldn't you say? Well reported in the newspapers of February 1865. Indisputable historical fact, according to the official records. However, you will find this in not a single American history textbook. This story remains one of the best kept secrets in American history. By the spring of 1865, 33% of the Army of the Potomac was comprised of United States Colored Troop regiments. Remember when General Grant became General Chief in the spring of 64? It was 0. 1 year later, it's 33%. Grant wants his powerful ally on the battlefield in the most important campaign, of course, the campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia. And Grant would position his powerful allies, his African American soldiers, on the front lines in front of Richmond. Now, I've read a number of scholars that have written, you know the reason they put African American soldiers on the front line? I know you've read this. You've heard it. That the reason they send them in first is so they get killed. You see, the generals thought that these were their worst soldiers, so they were sending their worst soldiers in first. Now, again, I want to point out that's not what I say. That's what many leading scholars to this day say to explain the fact that African American soldiers were on the front line in front of Richmond. So Grant was doing it because they were his worst soldiers? According to Grant, he called them powerful allies, right?
Right.
I spent 21 years in the United States Marine Corps. In the Marine Corps, we boast of going in first. Why? Because we're the best.
Right, right.
In the Army, the 82nd Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. 101st Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. That's American military doctrine. And I challenge you to find a single American military theorist, a single American general, who has ever written, we send our worst in first. That's like finding a football or basketball coach that says, well, I always send my worst players in first. No, he doesn't. He's trying to win the game. You send your best in first. These soldiers would say that the evidence of General Grant's confidence, their skill and bravery, was the fact that he put them on the front line. And General Grant would write in his memoirs that on April 3rd, 1865, the 25th Army Corps under General Godfrey Weitzel captured Richmond, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars, the 25th Army Corps is the only Army Corps in the history of the United States comprised of only African-American regiments. According to General Grant's order of battle, it is an indisputable historical fact that American soldiers of African descent captured and occupied the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Now that's headline news. Well reported in the newspapers of April 1865, but I challenge you to find it in a single American history textbook today. You could have read about it in New York newspaper. This is Frank Leslie's Illustrated. Paper again out of New York City. The accompanying article makes it very clear that these are men of African descent marching down Main Street in Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. You could have read about it also in Philadelphia newspapers, Boston newspapers, Chicago, San Francisco, but my favorite is the Washington, D.C. newspaper, the National Republican. Headlines on the evening of April 3rd, 1865 read, "Extra glorious fall of Richmond, captured by the black troops." Wow. Pretty clear who captured Richmond. Well reported in the newspapers of April of 1865. But again, I challenge you to find a single American history textbook today. This story remains one of the best kept secrets in American history. Now, when we talk about the end of the Civil War, we usually use the date April 9th, 1865. In this article, it says that Lee's army of Northern Virginia was retreating, that Lee is retreating. Well, he had taken his army from Richmond and Petersburg, and he was trying to take his army south and west, western North Carolina. He wanted to join his army of Northern Virginia with the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Joseph E. Johnston. But in the early morning of April 9, 1865, a brigade of United States colored troops, about 3,000 African-American soldiers, came up along the Lynchburg Road, and just south and west of a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, they engaged Lee's army in Northern Virginia. The fight lasted 5 hours. And at 8 a.m. in the morning, Lee decides that he can no longer continue to prosecute the war. And later that day, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant because that is where he was stopped by African-American soldiers. The only reason Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia is a stop along the Civil War trail is because African-American soldiers stopped Lee's army of Northern Virginia, forcing him to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. According to the official records, there were 14 African-American regiments present at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, when Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9, 1865. I challenge you to find that in a single American history textbook. I challenge you to find it in a single Civil War bestseller. If you write a book on the Civil War and you want it to be a bestseller, I'd advise you to leave this out. In fact, I will actually argue that no major publishing company will accept you, no matter if you provide the primary sources or not, because the decision would be, this book isn't going to sell. This story remains one of the best kept secrets in American history. It is the story of a disenfranchised, which means could not vote, enslaved population that answered a cry for help from the federal government, helped save the Union, and by enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, they freed themselves and their own families. One of the best kept secrets in American history is the story of their glorious march to liberty. Our memorial is called the African American Civil War Memorial, but I will often refer to it as simply an American memorial to American freedom fighters. It is because of these American freedom fighters that we honor at our museum and memorial today, that we can all today in this country, in good faith, pledge our allegiance to an indivisible republic. They fought to keep this one nation under God. With liberty and justice for all, they fought expressly to extend the blessings of liberty to all Americans, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, or origin. These are American heroes, American freedom fighters, and this is our American story of a glorious march